paint the tombs of the prophets. I help people look up from those pews and dream. They look up and they imagine that if they lived back in Christ's time, they wouldn't have done what the others did. They would have murdered those whom they now adore. I paint all this suffering that I don't suffer myself. I make a living of it. What we do is just create sympathy. We create admirers. Don't create followers. Christ's life is a demand. You don't want to be reminded of it. So we don't have to see what happens to the truth. Darker time is coming. And men will be more clever. They won't fight the truth. They'll just ignore it. I paint their comfortable Christ with a halo over his head. How can I show what I haven't lived? Someday I might have the courage to venture. Not yet. Someday I'll paint the true Christ.
You have landed on The Substance. I'm your host, Trevor Aiken.
And I'm your other host, Phil Marinello.
And we are back today with one of our favorite guests from the previous era, Brett McCracken.
Yeah, welcome back, Brett.
Thanks so much, guys. Great to be back with you. Excited to have another Malick conversation.
We're very excited. And
Yes.
we're excited to have a returning visitor. That's a nice little accomplishment to have had so far.
Yeah, you're number one on that.
Nice. The first repeat guest. I love it.
So, Trevor, why don't you start being the self-admitted least film guy? And
Yep.
This is your second.
My second,
You're
Malick.
2 of 2 Malick, and both being substantive cinema related. So why don't you lead us in?
Well, Malick, it's amazing the kind of work that he does. It's so, when you watch the film, it's very clear that it's a work of art. But the basic premise of the movie, we're dealing with the World War II era. You're taken into kind of a mountain top, kind of small village in Austria. And the story is about a man who, other than a biography that was finally published in the 70s, his life would have been unknown. And he resists the Nazi party. Basically, his beef is he won't swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler. And the film follows the struggle that creates for him and his family in his community and with his church as he goes from kind of nervously waiting to get called up a second time for military service to jail, and then ultimately, spoiler alert, his execution in Berlin as ultimately they condemn him for treason.
Absolutely. So, Brett, as the Malick expert, why don't you talk a little bit about placing this within the just overarching filmography of Malick and just in his body of work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's I believe it's his 9th feature film, and that's over the span of 40, 50 so years. 50, almost 50 years. His first film was in 72, Badlands. So he's definitely becoming more prolific in his later years. So
becoming far more prolific.
Mm-hmm.
Far more prolific, yeah. I mean, the thing about Malick in like the 90s when like The Thin Red Line came out is like, he's like this recluse who has only made 3 films in 30 years, and he averages, a film a decade. And so that was kind of the Malick story for the first half of his career. But then in the last 10 years, really since The Tree of Life, which I think jump-started him creatively, it was like the magnum opus that he had been wanting to make for 30 years or something, been trying to get made, and a very personal film, of course, for him. It's a life story in some ways. After that movie, he's been churning them out. I mean, he's had To the Wonder, Song to Song, Night of Cups, a documentary kind of Voyage of Time movie that I never actually released in theaters in America.
If I can interrupt, did you end up seeing Voyage of Time, Brett? I feel like I read your piece on that.
I thankfully LA was one of the places that had IMAX screenings of it, so I saw it twice in the one IMAX theater that was showing it, and
can't blame you.
So it was absolutely epic, as you would imagine, a Terrence Malick, film on IMAX. So it was a real shame that movie didn't get more distribution. I think Europe and some other parts of the world had more chances to see it. But anyway, so yeah, his output has definitely increased in the last decade. And in terms of where A Hidden Life falls, obviously thematically, there's lots of overlap, I think, with his other films, and we can talk about that. He's definitely prone to period films, so I would say probably, I can't think off the top of my head, but probably like 6 out of 9 of his films are period films, in terms of being set in some other period in history. And so
that's an interesting observation. Like I'd never pick that up, but that's absolutely true.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. So that's an interesting thing. And even though they're period films, their themes are timeless, I think, which is one of the beautiful things about an auteur like Malick, is he can experiment with different periods of history, even kind of different genre type things, and yet still explore the same, philosophical, theological ideas, or not the same, but similar ideas. It's his first film, and I believe it's his first film with mostly European actors, or non-native English-speaking actors. So the lead actors in this film are German actors, German-Austrian actors, who they spoke English in the film, but not their first language. So it's his second film about World War II. So that's an interesting little tidbit. Thin Red Line is the other one that's set in World War II. Of course,
yeah, I think I'm going to catch that next.
I think that's probably going to be your next one, Trev.
You have to see
which
that, Trevor.
we also promise you listeners,
Thin Red Line.
There will be variety in substantive cinema. It won't just be
a Malick fest.
Terrence Malick's filmography. Maybe we'll release it as a bonus.
Retitling the
hold
substance.
It for later. Which we could, but we absolutely are planning on. We've watched movies. We have movies on our watch list. It won't just be
art
transcendent,
cinema.
Spiritual auteur cinema.
But we don't have to apologize for the transcendent.
Oh, not at all. And rewatching this movie, I'm sure. Brett, before I say that, when was the last time you saw A Hidden Life?
I saw it early this year. I want to say early March. It was right when the pandemic was kind of starting. That's how I can date things. Pre-pandemic or post-pandemic. Or,
sure.
Yeah. But I saw it twice in theaters in the fall. I actually, before it even came out, I got to see a press screening on the Fox lot in Hollywood. And then I requested, with a publicist connection that I requested a second screening. I told them,
nice work.
I told them, I'm like one of the world's biggest Terrence Malick fans. I could write a book about this movie already. So in order to write a good review, I need to see it at least one more time. Can you arrange that for me? And they did. So they set up another screening for me. So I saw it twice before it came out, and then once just renting it on Amazon.
Nice. I saw it when it was in its theatrical run. I think that was end of 2019. or so.
December, yeah.
And so we watched it a few days ago. Like, it hit very hard at the end of 2019, but I mean, watching it a couple days ago was just like
it's even harder.
Hit like it was a ton of bricks, and it felt longer in the theater. Not that it was a negative thing, but like the impending sense of dread and like the anxiety and all that. Like, I left the film, I loved it. It was an incredible experience, but I was emotionally exhausted when I walked out of the theater. And my wife she almost didn't even like it for a couple of hours. She had to like let some of that wear off. Like, it's a very heavy film, but watching it recently, the 3 hours went by really fast, and you're just kind of amazed how he wrote this a number of years ago. It was in the editing process for a couple of years. Like, he didn't just cobble this all together to put it out in order to be timely. It was just the next thing on his heart. He had read some of the letters, the published letters, and became inspired to write this. And now it's just like kind of the perfect in good and kind of unfortunate ways of like, this is like the perfect movie for the time, I think. So when I reached out to you, I was like, okay, let's put together a couple of movies for our first batch of substantive cinema. I was just thinking, I was like, oh man, like, I bet A Hidden Life would be perfect. And it was almost scarily perfect.
Well, it's a couple of comments on that, because I think you're right. In fact, I'm teaching a class at my church this fall on Christians and politics, and how we as Christians, how we relate to, the political discourse. And I'm thinking about kind of assigning A Hidden Life as homework for one of the like sessions, because I do think
fist pumping right now. This is so
it
good.
raises such timely questions, but also timeless, and this is one of the things that I think we have to be careful with, is to not read into the film what's happening in America in 2020.
Correct.
And I lamented how much of the reviews and how much of the discourse kind of zeroed in on that and tried to make it into Malick's anti-Trump political film. I'm like, no, like he finished this film like before Trump was even elected president. Like, if you look at the production history, so it's not something Malick would do. He's not that kind of filmmaker. He's more interested in timeless, philosophical and theological ruminations. And B, it just doesn't even make sense with the chronology in terms of the politics of our current moment. But all that said, I do think that it's just uncanny how timely some of the principles and ideas really do fall in terms of our current moment.
Yeah, we weren't even necessarily planning this, because you just mentioned the church and politics, and our first episode is on politics also. And I'm sure, Brett, and what you're going to be teaching, you're going to try to be focusing on timeless truths as well, right? It's not about what you need to bring to 2020 so much as all of the truth of God's word applying to what we could call even political discernment. But and this movie even transcends that, because it's more about how a moral backbone can be very uncommon amongst a very religious people.
Yeah. I think the issues it raises are it's the challenge of discipleship. It's the cost of discipleship, no matter what culture you're in, no matter what era in history you're in. It's the narrow road versus the broad road. It's Scripture describes. It's the path of faithfulness is often a lonely path, and just because Christianity is enculturated or common doesn't mean that it's faithful always. And true faithful Christianity is often, you're the anomaly, not the norm. And I think this film really captures that in terms of Franz and his very lonely journey. Franz and Fanny as the two kind of pillars of faith in this culture and in this village that's pulling them, off the path of faithfulness. It's a timeless message for sure.
He's told by the mayor, right? You're the only one who refused. And that message to the faithful, you're the only one, right?
Thinking of the mayor character, I think what's so well played in that role is just how clearly you can tell that Franz gets under his skin, you know, and it's true of any culture that's trying to like pressure the lone, you know, holdouts to conform. Like it's that person who is unwilling to bend the knee to the mob that person is so offensive to the mob, because what that person does is shows that, no, there's another way. Like, you don't have to sell your soul. You don't have to compromise. Like, and it's a very disgusting thing for the mayor to watch the conviction and the virtue of Franz, because it reminds him of his own lack of virtue and lack of courage.
I think that's an interesting theme of the movie, and just I'm blanking right now on who famously coined the term, but just the banality of evil. Like the townspeople, especially.
Hannah Arendt coined that term, the banality of evil, in her book *Eichmann in Jerusalem*.
Yeah, Malick intercuts archival footage of Hitler and the parades and things like that, and you see he was the evil figurehead. But then you see like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people in the crowd all over Europe. It's implied that little village in the mountains that is kind of that secluded, almost Edenic type paradise place. It gets infected, and then the mayor starts spouting all the nationalistic tribal stuff, like us versus them, like they're the parasites, all these things. And it's like the folks in the village who are just following along are not like arbiters of evil themselves. They are folks who are open to stimuli and influence. And we see this in many things today, where it's like folks are asking the questions like, why do people who seem to be moral, or even folks of faith, why do they seem to sometimes be so oblivious to evil influences around them that affect them directly?
I love that aspect of the film where it's not, I've read this, I think it was either in yours or in Alyssa Wilkinson's, it's not a film about heroes per se. Films where, whether it's, you know, storm the hill or all this kind of thing, usually kind of in a wartime setting in a way, or like affect all this. And that's not to say that what Franz did wasn't lion-hearted, but it was simple. It was ordinary in a way. And there's an ordinariness even to the evil that he faces, right? Like it's not this maniacal kind of villain, but it's just everyday people. And I think the magic of it is you can really imagine yourself as any of the characters.
Totally. Yeah, I read the journals that the script is based off of, the actual journal of Franz Jägerstätter, his letters also between him and his wife. And just reading that, it was sobering to realize just what we're talking about, how at the time in these people's lives as just kind of normal farmers in Austria, like it was just kind of this thing that was bubbling up, and these rumors of this kind of this Nazi party that was gaining in power, and they were making these choices in real time. Franz is not grandstanding; he's not making this a big deal of it, although increasingly in his letters and in diary entries as he goes further on in time, and
he's kind of forced
the cost
right?
of it. He's forced to like make it more of an issue, but at first it's just kind of like, you know, they're talking about the weather and the harvest and the seasons, and and there's just a passing mention of like this nationalist party, and kind of you can tell Franz is not the biggest fan of it, but we look back on it and it's like, oh, the Nazi is this, you know, huge, scary, you know, force, this villainous force, but at the time it was just for these people and for countless other villages and people in Austria and Germany, it was just kind of the proximate reality.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's a good reminder for us that the banality of evil is a real thing. Evil is really just it's the choices we make and the small compromises we make, and really the lack of critical thinking that we sometimes exhibit, where we don't question the the things that are happening around us and the things that we're being asked to believe or go along with. And I think that's what this movie really shows beautifully, is how subtle that really is.
And I think even more so because of the specific nature of Franz. Like, he wasn't ordered to go torch a village or go kill civilians or anything. The point of contention in the film was an oath of loyalty to Hitler that even one of the clergy was trying to get him to go along with the flow so as to not endanger himself or endanger his family. He's like, God knows your heart. These are just words. God knows, like, you're not offending God. Just go with the flow and swear loyalty to Hitler. This was his shepherd who was leading him to swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler. And we can look at that through the lens of history and go, how in the world did he do that?
Yeah, you don't gain national prominence and power by publicly being recognized as dark and villainous. And what's funny, too, is we forget, and obviously there's other films that kind of explore this angle, that there's people in the States, too, that, like Charles Lindbergh and others who...
That was not subtle.
Yeah, who were like, yeah, this makes sense. And there was people, I was reading about a philosopher who, after the war, was like, hey, like, if it wasn't the Nazis, it would have been the Bolsheviks. Like, this was a necessary kind of thing, like, even after the war. So for the people involved in it, it's not black and white. I love what you said. It's subtle. It's small compromises. And it's also, on the other hand, it almost seems like it's small acts of fortitude, small acts of critical thinking, small acts of faithfulness that rises to that occasion.
Yeah, we can take courage from his example. I believe it was his interrogator and even his lawyer and some other folks. The rhetoric was, what are you hoping to accomplish? You're not going to change things. You're one guy. And by the time he was arrested, it's like, we're in prison. Nobody knows what happens behind these walls. Like, you think you're standing for something, and it's not going to matter.
Yeah. Which makes it so much more valorous and virtuous, because, like, he's not living in the age of social media and virtue signaling. You know, he's not making a stand publicly, and that's when virtue really shines, is when you're doing the right thing just because it's the right thing, not because anyone notices, which is exactly what the interrogator tries to use against him. But I think it makes him all the more heroic.
And it's when we transcend that kind of pragmatism, utilitarian thinking, that kind of thinking is what got the society into the bad place where it was in the first place. That the individual life lived morally and virtuously on its own has value.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Can we go back to something, the logic of saying that God knows your heart. So it's just words. I think that line about it's your heart that matters, it's not your outward actions. That's where this film is, like, in conversation with Silence, which I don't know if both of you have seen Martin Scorsese's Silence.
We have.
I love Silence. We were thinking about doing that one too, and it's like, we don't want to just do stuff like that, but I think at some point we'll touch on Silence on the show.
Yeah,
that would be a great one. I mean, that is one of the most interesting theological films of the last decade. Hopefully this isn't spoiling it for listeners who haven't seen Silence, but essentially the main character, Andrew Garfield's priest character in Silence, is forced to make a similar choice. Like, do I compromise my convictions for my own self-preservation, and is Jesus okay with that? Or do I die, but keep my conscience intact and keep my convictions pure? And that's the same choice Franz is making. But the two films come to different conclusions about it. So Silence, based on the novel by Shusaku Endo, resolves the tension by exactly what the priest character tells Franz. Like, actually, like, Jesus himself would want you to he would give you grace for this compromise. He would say, I know where your heart's at. Yeah, I know you trust me, you love me, but I want you to live on. So go ahead and betray me publicly. That's fine. I'll forgive you. But Malick, his answer to it is, no, your works matter, and like you can't just get off with the supposed grace of God covering your betrayal. You need to be faithful to the end and not betray the name of Jesus and your allegiance to Jesus.
It's kind of like what Jesus said about the cup of water. Even something as simple as that, if it was done in my name, he says, that person's not going to lose their reward. Like, I see that, and that matters for me. The value is there, right? The value is in him and in living before his face.
And I think it was Fanny's father, the line, better to suffer injustice than do it. And looking around at the landscape that we find ourselves in today, that is not rhetoric I often hear from believing folks with platforms. Obviously, we don't want to seek out martyrdom, but when it comes to, we see injustice, we see sin being inflicted upon our neighbors, and are we going to stand up for godly principles? Are we going to enact and like live out gospel love of neighbor, or are we just going to be quiet? Like, are we going to allow others to suffer injustice, or are we going to speak up and potentially get some of that on ourselves?
Mm-hmm. What's interesting about the Franz story is that it's not a social justice act in the sense that it really has little connection to other people, and that's the whole quiet, hidden nature of it. It's really just about him, his conscience, his beliefs, and what he's being asked to do or not to do. Again, it's not being broadcast on social media. He's not part of any hashtag campaign. So it's the injustice it's a personal injustice.
It's just a pure test of faithfulness.
Yeah, he's not like a Bonhoeffer who like is involved in a plot to try to affect the overflow. It's just literally like, no, I can't stand for this.
Yeah, it's not part of a broader resistance movement necessarily. I just wanted to touch on, like, there's been some interesting discussion in some other panels I've been on about this film, just about, is there any way that we can fault Franz or kind of complicate the heroism of him in the sense of how does it affect his family and Franny and his kids and those who suffer because of his choice? And is there any selfishness or pride on his part in terms of the only thing he's affecting by dying for this cause is making his wife's life harder, basically, and his family's, his kids being raised without a father. And so I don't know if you guys have thoughts about that at all. It's something I've wrestled with a little bit myself and thinking about the film and what I would do in that circumstance. And the ethical thing is sometimes not cut and dry when you consider all the ways that a choice one way or the other has ramifications.
Yeah, I think the question almost comes from a place, I don't want to be too simplistic with this comment, but it's almost an American way to approach it because we are so individualistic. But I think the Bible kind of talks about the collective nature of being a person in community, right? That your individual moral actions affect all those around you, both for good and for ill. And so, yeah, when you take a stand for something, it can't not affect those around you.
Yeah.
And so it does complicate it. But I think Fanny says this where she's praying to God and says that you love him more than I do. That is the ethical reality that has to be brought in those moments, is the fact that, like, we entrust into the care of the Father the things that we can't compensate for because we're not powerful enough. We can't provide for our families after our deaths. We can't mitigate the effects of the virtuous choice on those that we love. Christ goes to the cross and he knows, and Mary was told from the beginning that is going to be pain for her as well. And does what he can do, right, with John taking care of her. But because we are people in a community, there's always an effect like that.
My take is not that we seek out pain, but it doesn't strike me as a very sanctified or eternal or a truly Christian perspective to elevate the comforts of life to such a point to where that doesn't take into account the moral harm of him going against his conscience and actually swearing an oath of loyalty to Hitler, the moral damage that would do to his family and his children.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's hard to grow up without a dad, but I imagine it would not be easy to grow up with a dad who was a Nazi.
Yeah. I think the pragmatism piece that we were just talking about is it reminds me of one of the lines where one of the characters said to follow him is insanity. And I think what it boils down to with following Jesus is just that. Like, we can't approach faith pragmatically and kind of making all these calculations of, well, how's it going to be for this, and how's it going to affect my family, and how's it going to, work with my reputation. What it boils down to is it's always costly, and to choose to follow him in the way that, he calls us to, is always going to be a little crazy. It's always going to look like folly in the eyes of the world. And, even some of the things Jesus says about family in the Gospels, when he's asked, like, who is your mother or brother? And he kind of says that really countercultural, shocking thing about, like, basically disowning his blood family and saying, those who follow the will of my Father are my family. So, yeah, I think the worldly attachments, as good as they are to family, to blood family, Franz knows that the following Jesus is a higher allegiance even to that good, that virtuous and wonderful thing of his family that he's been given. But that is the biggest cost for him. He knows what it's going to cost Fanny and his kids, and he chooses it anyway. And yet the film, from the beginning scene, it kind of frames everything in this eschatological hope of, like, we will meet again, and you will, just as we met with me wearing my best dress and you riding in on the motorcycle, like, we'll meet in the valley, under the shadows of the mountains again one day. And that's the hope that I think Franz has when he goes to his death, is that hope of the resurrection and reunion, which makes a dark film, still dark, but hopeful as well.
And that you hit on a theme that we're going to link it in the show notes. You wrote a truly phenomenal piece on the Gospel Coalition on it. And I think the part that resonated the most with me and I thought was just such a beautiful insight was the bride and bridegroom imagery, the relationship between the two, and just the clear theological and ultimately eschatological and eternal implications of that picture. And that's something that all good pastors talk about, like the unique nature of the parable of marriage. Like, marriage is the gospel and the gospel is marriage. And can you talk about that for a little bit?
I mean, that was a connection that really clicked with me the second time I saw the film. I was just thinking about how central their marriage is in the film, and what is Malick doing, even with some shots of, like, their hands clasped together with their wedding rings visible. And he's clearly making a parable, or a parallel between, the vows and the covenant of marriage and faith, and how, we as people of faith are in covenant with the bridegroom, Christ, but he's absent, right? For so much of Franz and Fanny's relationship in the later few years, they're apart, right? They only know each other through letters, and they're hidden from each other, and there's this distance. And I think that's how it can feel as the bride of Christ, as the church. Like, Jesus is there. We know, we trust him. We love him. He's our, we're in covenant with him, but it's still a struggle because we wish he was in the flesh. We wish he was here with us, in the dirt, with his hand on the plow along with us, but, he's not. And so I think Malick is.
And those were some of the hardest scenes. Those were some of the hardest scenes to watch for me. Again, the banality of evil, one of just the most, like, wild shots in the movie. It just stands out so, and I remember it from the first time I saw it too, just their neighbor just casually going into their field and stealing from them because there was nobody there to protect them.
Yeah. I think and I talked about this in my review, like the prominence of like kind of widow characters, like women who are alone and kind of forging ahead in life without the support and kind of the security and the stability of their husbands. So the mother-in-law character, Fanny herself, and there's probably other women in the village who are either widowed or their husbands are just off fighting. And to me, it really clicked that's like, and that's why widows, I think, are close to the heart of Jesus in the New Testament. Like, care for the widow, watch after the widow. That's one of the church's like calls of compassion, because that's our story as the church. We're kind of like a widow on earth. Like our bridegroom is off, like he's away, he's in heaven, and he's alive and not dead. And so in that sense, we're not widows, but in the sense that we're kind of having to kind of deal and struggle in a sense in a vulnerable place. And I feel like I could relate to Fanny in that struggle a little bit. And even some of the scenes of her just like pushing the plow on her own, trying to like manage the kids and live in this harsh climate, this harsh world alone. So I can sometimes feel like what faith is. And you're like, man, I wish Jesus was just here. I wish he was present and he could just like defeat all the enemies and conquer all the struggles, but he's not, and that's the journey of faith. And so, as much as this film is about historical period and a real historical act of courage on the part of a real person, in some ways, it's a parable for the life of faith and the life of the Christian, which is kind of what I focus my review on. And the more I think about the film and watch it, it stands out to me as one of the best films I've ever seen on capturing that dynamic, the beauty and the struggle of faith in a world that is doing everything it can to cause you to forsake your faith and your belief. And Fanny is faithful, right? She's the heart of the film. In some ways, her courage is even greater than Fran's, because she has every reason to betray her husband and say, like, you're going to leave me? You're going to leave me to this alone? Like, why would I stick by you? Why would I keep my faith in you? And yet she does, even though the cost is absolutely immense for her.
One of the things that was very good. There was something earlier that you brought up, just kind of its place in history. And I don't know if do you have it in front of you, Trevor, or I can read it. The Eliot quote that opens the movie up, or no, it closes the movie out, rather, I believe.
Yeah, I've got it in front of me.
You want to read that?
Sure, I'll read that for you. For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and the things that are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs.
So, I mean, the implication of that, and that is kind of where the movie gets its name, and the thesis of this guy by himself that would have been lost to history if he didn't have his letters published. He has made our world and others' lives better because of his courage. And it would not have been better to give his children a father and his wife a husband. It would not have been better to compromise.
At that cost.
Like, at the cost of his integrity and his truth, and at some point, if nobody ever stood up to Hitler, it would have been worse. And now we have the choice to either stand up to evil or not. So it doesn't have to be historic, or like you said, it doesn't have to be #activism, or we don't have to have a camera or a microphone in our face in order to be genuinely effective.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be like, oh, well, what's the benefit of this?
Yeah.
Well, it's a good thing. That's the benefit of this.
Yeah, I think the beauty of quiet faithfulness is a takeaway for me from the film. Like, I think if I could just kind of diagnose like the health of the church in America, like, I think we just suffer from a severe lack of grit in terms of quiet faithfulness.
Right.
Like if we just all committed to living our lives, in keeping with what Scripture calls us to, just hand to the plow, loving people in our spheres of influence, being Christ-like in our spheres of influence, that would make the world a better place. It might not move the needle on any social media conversation. It might not get any headlines, but I think part of the problem is we're spending more of our energy as Christians today kind of in that, virtue signaling space of like, am I saying the right things? Am I joining the right hashtag, movements? All of that, has its place, but ultimately Jesus just calls us to follow him in our individual spaces of life and influence in our homes, our communities. This film just was a real reminder of how beautiful that is, and how that Eliot quote is just so gorgeous, and such a beautiful reminder that sometimes you don't even recognize the hidden lives and the quiet faithfulness from millions of people who live those lives. We still don't know about them, and we will never know, maybe, until heaven. But that's a life well lived, even if no one knows about it.
Yeah. No, that's. I feel like there's so much when it comes to things like virtue signaling or trying to figure out like people are trying to figure out what's their responsibility. What's the responsibility of the person of faith? And that's the thing that is challenging, because this film shows, even though we look back and we think that the choice of the faithful is clear-cut and obvious, that it wasn't clear-cut and obvious for everyone, right? Everyone who's going along with it's charging Franz with sin. They're charging him with pride. They're charging him with, in a sense, virtue signaling. And so, do you condemn me? Do you judge me? He's asked. And well, no, I just think this is right. Like, this is just what I believe is right. And so there's a vacuum where Christians are kind of trying to figure out, well, what's right? Is this, am I doing the right thing? Am I offending people? And how do I actually live with people? And sometimes it seems like we've just got these big elephants in the room on how to live, how to go about something in a way that would be ultimately, pleasing to Christ, that would be the right thing to do. That leaves Christians either on the one side saying, well, I'm just going to go along with the culture of my church and just trust that. And on the other hand, leave others with, okay, like, let me try to figure out this thing that's the kind thing to do or the not offensive thing to do. And others, it's performative, and you just kind of get a chaos, as opposed to, hey, this is the faithful, quiet life that in some ways ends up being louder than it intends to be. Franz's life, like to his village at least, is very disquieting to the leaders and the people around, but not because he's being loud, but because his witness is loud.
Yeah. Good.
Running towards the end here, Brett, but I definitely want to hit the scene with the artist in the church,
the comfortable Christ,
the painter of relics and the creator of admirers.
Not followers.
So you wrote about that as a bit of a Malick stand-in. What about that scene stood out to you?
Yeah, that's the scene that I feel like a lot of people have found really interesting, and I'm not the only one who's wondered if Malick is kind of making a meta statement about his own kind of perspective as an artist. And clearly Malick is a religious artist, just like this guy in the scene. He's someone who wants to present audiences with cinematic depictions of faith and Jesus, maybe in more roundabout ways than the overt ways that the painter is in the film. But yeah, I actually, the next time I see this film, I want to pause and kind of look at that scene more. But I do wonder if Malick that's his inner struggle. Like, I don't want to just present Christianity as it's comfortable either to the audience or to me. I want to really wrestle with the the uncomfortable aspects of faith and present audiences with Jesus that will discomfort them. And it's interesting that his next film is like his most explicitly Jesus film. Like, it's a historical film about Christ with a literal actor playing Jesus. It's called The Last Planet. It's currently being filmed in Italy, I think. So that's interesting. It's almost like that scene is kind of perhaps foreshadowing
the meta statement
in his 10th film, which is going to be presenting Jesus in the most direct way he has yet.
Wow.
So
I think the first bits of dialogue I thought were very interesting. It was both a condemnation, but a gracious condemnation. And it's when you hear pastors often talk about, when talking about either the nation of Israel in the Old Testament or the crowd who ended up condemning Christ in the Gospels, because the artist himself made that comment saying, these folks think that if they lived back then like they would be on the side of the righteous, but like they wouldn't. And their words to Franz were, just go along, like God knows your heart, like think about your family. And they're the ones looking at these paintings going, oh, like, isn't that so pretty? Like, I would love to be around like halo-y Jesus with like the glowing idealistic view. Like, I'd love to hang out and have a meal with like floaty angel and Jesus, when like, no, like now you're in the midst of like an onslaught of true evil, and your advice is to go along with it.
Right. Yeah, it's almost like Malick is speaking to just the dynamic of how often Christians just make Jesus into their own image, or they make Jesus kind of conveniently affirm whatever comfortable paradigm they already have. And so Jesus inevitably becomes a comfortable Jesus because we domesticate him in whatever, whether we're on the political left or the political right or anywhere in between. That's just the human tendency. And I think Malick, is the artist character, is trying to communicate that Jesus is always going to like unsettle you and discomfort you a bit and challenge your paradigms. And faithfulness is being willing to be, made uncomfortable when confronted with the true Jesus. And it's also like asking us that really provocative question, which I think that we should always ask ourselves is would we have been any different, as Christians in Germany in that moment? Would we have made any different choices? Like in things like slavery, like if we were white Christians in, the antebellum South, like would we have stood up against slavery, like, and called it an unbiblical thing? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't think I would. Like, it's easy to look back on history and say, and
historically, you wouldn't.
Your virtue.
Yeah, we wouldn't.
But, yeah. It's just a good reminder, I think, for all of us to just be sober about our constant temptation to want to have a faith, have a Jesus that affirms whatever we want to be true about our culture, about our life. And yeah, I mean, that takes so many different forms. But I think that's one of the big takeaways for this film is, where in my life am I, choosing comfort or kind of forcing my faith to affirm me, where it should be calling me to deny some aspect of my existence.
One of the things that's so challenging to continue to have Christ unsettle us is that we find the one place that he has unsettled us in the past. And so we say, therefore, and this is a struggle I found in my own heart, like, therefore, I am with Jesus. Therefore, I am on the side of the righteous. Therefore, I am, I have removed myself from the crowd of people who condemn Christ, because I had this one thing that I used to be, and he changed me on that. And that can be so many different things, theologically or socially, or different issues that we come learn about. But it's like, we have to continue to be challenged by the character of Christ, continue to be unsettled, because because he kicks us out of one track doesn't mean that we should be comfortable in another track. Like, the cause of Christ, it doesn't seem like is ever going to just fit neatly into a track, fit neatly into, like you said, a political party, fit neatly into
any sort of
any
identity
kind of
outside
human structure, right? They all can be critiqued by his morality and his perfect life. And so we have to be so careful to always be critiquing ourselves and our commitments and our participation in these movements and our identification in that. Because if we don't, we, in a sense, lose that just pure identification with Christ rather than identifying with some other kind of trend or entity in our time.
Right. Yeah, it's a very big difference between fandom of Jesus and followers. And I mean, that's what this film confronts us with, is what does following Jesus require? What is the cost of discipleship? And you're exactly right. It's a question we should ask ourselves constantly. What does allegiance to Jesus above all look like? Because if we're honest with ourselves, we are almost always putting our allegiance to Jesus a little bit below other allegiances. And I mean, that's where things go haywire. That's why the political kind of scene in America with evangelicals is frankly so corrupt, is because so many have reversed the order of allegiances, and Jesus is just a nice add-on or a justification for a higher allegiance to politics or, a certain cultural, preference or something. But that, I mean, that's a temptation across the board. So I'm not saying any one side of any issue is guilty of it only. I think we're all prone to, just not having our allegiances in the right priority as Christians.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry about the babies crying in the background.
No,
that's
great.
all right. We've got kids running around here
waking
too
up from naps right now.
There you go. Well, it's his
you go.
first podcast.
Yeah.
Well, we super duper appreciate your time. Before we let you go, I did want to ask, we do a segment on our show called Substance Shoutouts, and we're not going to do that ourselves here, but as particularly with your position at the Gospel Coalition, Arts and Culture, what have you been reading, watching, listening to that you have found particularly substantive or of value or enjoyment?
Yeah, it's been a weird summer for movies, of course, because so few have been released in the pandemic. But probably the best movie I've seen recently is the documentary Boys State that won one of the Sundance Awards this year. It's a really timely, interesting look at politics through the lens of this high school mock politics camp, Boys State. So that's one recommendation I would have. And then, music is so hard because there's so much music being released these days. It's hard to keep up with it, but I've been really enjoying Josh Garrels' new album of hymns recently. There's a book that I'm just reading now that is kind of speaking about Jesus and kind of what it means to follow Jesus. It's a really beautiful look at the heart of Jesus. It's called Gentle and Lowly.
Yes.
By Dane Orland. It's
So
one
good.
of the most beautiful kind of theological reflections I've read in some time. So I would recommend that one to every Christian. Just kind of like, you strip everything away, like what is the heart of Jesus and what is it that we're called to do with him? That's a beautiful book. I would recommend Gentle and Lowly.
I second that shout out for sure.
My music listening's been terrible. I always appreciate when you post music recommendations, just because I feel like now that I'm an old man in my 30s, like I have bands and artists that I really like that I find out on Twitter after they've released a project, and I'm like, I don't even know they were like coming out with one. So I feel
so hard to
terribly
keep up
out of the
these days.
loop.
There's so much music being released in the age of streaming. And
It is terribly sad about movie theaters, but I completely understand. But I hope all the independent theaters make it, and that we get to see some new movies
in an
actual theater at some point here soon.
I know. I'm waiting for the day when I can safely return to a movie theater. Maybe I'll see Tenet in theaters in the next few weeks.
I'm really considering it. I'm super considering it.
Yeah.
Well, hey, Brett, thanks again for your time. We would love to have you back at some point in the future. We don't want to take too much of your time. Maybe for a non-Malick one for a change. But
yeah, we should try that. For sure.
It's always a pleasure reading your work and having you on. And I don't know that I would have been exposed to this kind of stuff without you guys. So I appreciate that. And I'm sure many of our listeners do as well. So definitely everybody check out Hidden Life.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll have links in the show notes to where you can rent or purchase it digitally as well.
Great. Thank you, guys. It was a great conversation.
We'll be in touch. We'll talk to you later, Brett.
Okay. See ya.
Bye-bye.
See you, man. Well, guys, thanks so much for joining us for this Substantive Cinema episode. Man, what a great conversation. So much fun. That was an excellent conversation. We hope you guys enjoyed that as much as we did. Yeah, absolutely. And hit us up on... You can follow us at facebook.com/thesubstancepod or at Twitter and Instagram at thesubstancepod. And you can send us an email. Yeah, absolutely. Our email address is thesubstancepod@gmail.com. And especially if you watched A Hidden Life, let us know what you think about the film, what moments stood out to you. What do you think about kind of some of the ethical things that we talked about, or the way the moral fortitude of A Hidden Life matters? And you can also, if you want to talk to us about those things, call our phone line, 913-703-3883. You basically go straight to voicemail on that so that you can leave us a message. And we would love to hear your thoughts, your feedback, and if it's something that's pretty profound or we just like it for whatever reason, you could end up on the show. Give us a call, leave us a message. I want to throw it out there. We want you to, if you have any interest in seeing this, highly suggest you seek out this film. We're going to put links in the show notes to rent or purchase it. And this is the type of film that is viewed really well in a group. So if you get a group of people together and see this movie because of this discussion, we absolutely want to hear about how that goes. We do like movie club evangelism. Nice. And we're looking forward to our next Substantive Cinema when Vince will be here with us and join us. Oh, that one's going to be the... do we want to tease what that's going to be? You can. You do what you need to do, man. I'll say this. I am really looking forward to that discussion because famously in our friend group, Trevor, you and I are on pretty opposite ends of the spectrum, and all pretty much thus far in the substantive cinemas that we've had, in the few that we've had so far, we've pretty much been on the same side. So I did not love this film the first time I saw it. So super interested to watch it with you and then have that discussion. I think that's going to be a really good conversation. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us for the show this week, and we'll see you next time. This was a phenomenal movie that we probably could have talked for hours and 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 hours.